So, good evening. I'm Simon Nightingale. I'm chair of Shropshire Humanists, which is the organisation that have arranged this event. Now, we have regular monthly events, usually held at the University Centre, just downstream from here. But for today's speaker, we anticipated a large audience, so we're having it here in the Walker Theatre. Now, you've each paid £10 for your seat. I hope you have. And all the proceeds from tonight are going to go to the Shropshire Food Poverty Alliance, which coordinates all the food banks. Professor Grayling is not asking for a fee, and so once we've paid for the venue, we'll probably be about £1,500 to the Food Poverty Alliance. So thank you for donating. We have a variety of interesting talks coming up. Just run very quickly. In April, Miller and Alex Prishizna will be talking about the Ukraine since the invasion almost exactly 2 years ago. Miller will be talking about how Shropshire Ukrainians are helping people back home, and Alex, a consultant of the orthopedic, will be talking about the medical situation on the front lines. They'll be bringing some Ukrainian cakes to the meeting for you to sample, and also some traditional Ukrainian clothes for sale. So all the sales and donations that evening will be going to their organisation. In May, we have a talk on an old chestnut, immigration. I hear you mentally groaning, but this is going to be different. It won't be about the politics or the economics or the legality or the public opinion. It'll be about the morality of migration, a factor that's often missing from the debates. It'll be an interesting talk, and it may ruffle a few feathers. And then later in the year, we've got Christopher French, professor and head of the Nominalistic Psychology Research Department at Goldsmith College. And he's talking on the science of the weird stuff, why our minds conjure the paranormal. So it should be interesting and I think entertaining. So if you want to find out more about these, when you leave, there's a table there, and ask them and they'll give you details. I'd also like to mention what I hope most of you know, that everybody is welcome at our humanist events, whether they have religious faith or not. Shropshire Humanists feel it's unhealthy for humanists just to meet with other humanists. It creates an echo chamber of ideas and a sort of them-us ethos, and that's not good. So it's now my very pleasant duty to introduce Professor Grayling, who of course is well known to the humanists because he's vice president of Humanist UK. So Anthony has an alphabet of academic acronyms after his name, but also a CBE, which is not to be sniffed at. And he is the principal of Northeastern University in London, where he's also professor of philosophy. He is a supernumerary fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford. He's the author of over 30 books on philosophy, biography, history of ideas, and essays. He was for a number of years columnist on The Guardian, The Times, and Prospect magazine. And he's continued to contribute to many leading newspapers in the UK, US and Australia, and to BBC 4 and 3 and the World Service, where he did the annual Exchanges at the Frontier series, and he's often appeared on television. He's twice been the judge of the Booker Prize, in 2014 serving as the chair of the judging panel. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a president of Humanist UK, a patron of Defence Humanists, honorary associate of the Secular Society, and a patron of Dignity in Dying. And despite all that, Professor Grayling finds the time to come and talk to us.
Thank you very much indeed for your hospitality here this evening. I'm going to talk to you about some themes that I discussed in a book which came out a couple of years ago, and I was invited by Simon and the humanists here to come and talk about the book then. Then you may remember there was a mild, virus going around and it disrupted everything and so on, so it kind of put it back. And now the opportunity arises to talk about those themes. And the themes in question concern one very familiar thing, which is the climate crisis. The slightly less familiar thing is the congeries of very rapidly advancing technological developments in our world, some of which we're aware of, and some of which we're not. And we're not being able to think about them and discuss them properly, and to consider ways to manage them and perhaps to anticipate some of their ill effects, precisely because these developments are overtaking us. They are so rapid that we find ourselves, to our great surprise, actually living in the future already without realizing that we are. And I want to mention one or two of those to you. And I'd like also, therefore, to suggest at least one major reason why there is a climate crisis and why these technological developments are such that they are racing ahead without proper consideration of how to put them into a framework and help us to deal with their implications properly. And I have to say that one aspect of the difficulty there arises from something to which I've described in the book as a law. And because it's a law with rather ominous characteristics, I've given it my own name, and it's called Grayling's law. And it states this: it says, if something can be done, it will be done, if it brings profit or advantage to whoever can see that it's done. So, for example, just for example, supposing, and I mean, one barely needs to suppose this, but supposing that it's possible to engineer the genetics of a very early stage fetus. We implant it in the womb, but to engineer it so that it has characteristics that we find desirable. 6'5", blue-eyed, blonde-haired, IQ of 200, can run 100 meters in 5 seconds, and so on. So we want it to be absolutely super, and we can do it. And then let us suppose that the United Nations and all the world governments decide, nope, we want to stick with the old Model T version of human beings, bad teeth and aging and arthritis and so forth. So we're not going to have this kind of thing. We're going to outlaw it. Now just imagine that scenario. Well, because it can be done in this scenario, it can be done that we can engineer the genes of the fetus, then my law states that it will be done. There will be people rich enough or bad enough, if those are two disjoint classes, who will do it, who will get it done. So anything that can be done will be done if it brings advantage to whoever can get it done. And sadly, there is a corollary, the obverse of that law, which is that those things that can be done won't be done if they bring a cost to whoever can stop them. So something can be done. We can do something about the climate. Why are we not doing enough about the climate? Well, because it costs too much to people who don't want to stop making profits. And so they can drag their feet, or they can resile, as President Trump did, from the 2012 Paris Accords on the climate, remove the United States from that, or threaten to, because it brings a cost. Because, for example, it harms some of his voters, the people in the coal industry, let us say. So something can be done, but it won't be done if it brings a cost to whoever can stop it. And that's the corollary of that law. And I just want to mention this and leave it in the background of our minds, because it has a great deal to do with why it is that the world and what's happening in the world seems to be running out of control. At any rate, it seems to be running out of our ability really to do something sensible and rational about it. Okay, so on the climate, now I'm not going to talk a very great deal about the climate because it's a very, very familiar matter. Obviously, we're all aware of the fact that climate change is happening. We have been witness to extreme weather events which in part at least must be assignable to the change which is happening, the warming of the climate. We know that the desire to try to limit global warming below 2 degrees has already been breached. There are very serious anxieties about what the impact will be by the mid-century or by the end of this century from the point of view of rising sea levels, desertification, more extreme weather events, and what those consequences will be for societies around the world, for human beings, and indeed for nature in general. It is already the case, and has already been for some time the case, that pretty well all natural species, botanical and zoological, are having to move in the direction of the poles, northwards in the northern hemisphere and southwards in the southern hemisphere, at 1 kilometer a year, to try to maintain in the same environmental niche to which they are adapted because of the way that the planet is warming. So that's happening already, been happening for some time. And of course there are a number of other effects. For example, we're now beginning to suspect that the North Atlantic channel, which keeps us in these islands relatively warm or fairly mild weather here, it looks as if it might be changing direction. And if it does, of course, we're going to be in a problem. I mean, don't forget that if you were to take the British Isles and move them around the latitude of the planet, you would end up in Hudson's Bay in Canada. And the only reason why we're not frozen solid like Hudson's Bay is most of the year is because of the North Atlantic current. If the current changes, then things are going to be very different here, and so on. Now, the thing is that we're all very familiar with this, to the point where when anybody mentions climate change, global warming, our eyes begin to glaze over. And we begin to think, well, there's nothing I can do about it, especially when I hear that however vigorously and assiduously I recycle and switch off the gas and freeze at home, you know, let alone the fact I can't pay my bills, but anyway, I'm trying to save the planet, that even if every single human individual on the planet were to do these things, it still wouldn't be enough. Because the only thing which is going to really have an impact on trying to reduce the degree to which the planet is warming is holistic international activity, whether everybody in the planet and the governments really do a number of things, ranging all the way from changing the way that we produce and consume to try to find technological solutions of some kind, carbon capture and the rest. So we know that this is something that the world as a whole, the international endeavor as a whole, has to deal with. And even though we show our willingness and our commitment by recycling and by trying to be as green as possible, nevertheless, that is an aspirational commitment on our part, a matter of our consciousness of what's going on in our planet, and yet that individually we're not going to be able to make a difference, except in a way that I want to mention later. So we're familiar with this problem, and as I say, the very familiarity of the problem is what makes most people try not to think about it too much, because they feel impotent in the face of it, and also we're over familiar, and it's like, you know, doom mongering is always very rebarbative. We feel that we want to think about something nicer, put it on Netflix instead, something like that. So that is one of the problems with climate change. I just want to mention just a couple of little things which sort of surprise one in a way when one views what the problem is in our planet. Here's one thing. If you were to ask somebody, and I will ask you now, what percentage of fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported? What percentage of the fresh water consumed in the UK is imported? Now, when you ask that question, you get a couple of different kinds of answers. People immediately begin to think of, you know, bottles of Evian or, you know, that kind of thing. One of my students once said to me, well, 100% comes in the clouds in the form of rain, and that's a reasonably rational sort of answer. The answer is 70%. 70% of the fresh water we consume in these islands is imported in the form of fresh fruit and vegetables grown mainly in countries where there are water shortages because they are hot countries, tomatoes and oranges, and flown from those countries to this country to be reasonably fresh in the supermarket. Now, there are 3 levels of insanity right there. That we import fresh water in the form of fruit and vegetables produced in countries with not enough water of their own, and we fly them here. So we're living in a world which commits acts of insanity on a number of different levels on a daily basis, which have an impact on the climate, and we're still doing it now. Aeroplanes have arrived in this country today carrying crates of oranges and tomatoes. So that's one consideration. Here is another consideration. In what's called the global south, now that phrase, of course, just means the poorer economies of the world. It doesn't literally mean the southern hemisphere, because of course it includes large parts of South Asia too, like Bangladesh and so on. But anyway, it's a substitute for what used to be called the third world. So in the global south, the people who are by far the most likely to suffer of the impacts of climate change, of desertification, or of failure of clean water supplies, or of extreme weather events and so on, the people most likely to suffer are women and girls. Think of it. In those parts of the world, very, very few women learn to swim. So if there are floods, they're immediately at risk, they're immediately vulnerable. Traditional clothing in the global south is such that if you are caught up in if you are a woman caught up in a flood, your clothing is going to drown you. Not only can't you swim, but you're going to be drowned by the clothes that you wear. As the difficulties increase of getting fresh water, so the people who traditionally and typically fetch water, which are women and girls, have to walk further to find it and are more exposed to harassment and attack. So, climate change, I mean, when one asks questions about how does it affect people, how does it affect individuals, if you go right down to the granular level and consider what life is like under climate change, and you think of those considerations, you begin to get a feeling for what the problem is really like. And yet that doesn't get into the debate either. So, in fact, our tendency to talk in rather general terms about degrees of warming and about large-scale endeavors and about climate conferences and what have you. You know, we see every year people coming from all around the world in aeroplanes to climate conferences to discuss with one another what to do. To try, you know, only Greta Thunberg is sailing across the Atlantic together. But we see that we're not really getting to grips with it. We're not really thinking about it seriously. Of course, there are serious efforts being made by major players around the world. I think most governments now in the industrial countries really are wanting to appear to be good citizens and trying to cut emissions and also trying to, you know, limit the degree to which warming is happening. But the problem is that the warming is continuing to happen, and it will continue to have these large-scale problems. So let me just park that as something familiar enough to make us stop thinking about it, if we're over-familiar with it, and leave those couple of little thoughts about the sort of madness of things like the fresh water situation or the people who are most harmed about it. Let me park it for a minute, and I'll come back and mention something in connection with it later. Let me turn my attention now to the question of technology. Well, we're all familiar with the fact, since we have seen in the course of our own lifetimes, and even indeed just in the course of the last few decades, how very, very, very fast technology has developed. I mean, I think quite a few of us in this room now will have just about got the hang of the telephone that you dial, let alone the one that you have to press the thing on to wake up the operator, put me through to whoever it might be. We've seen really, really extraordinary developments. And they have been very rapid because technological development is self-potentiating. The more development there is, the more development is enabled by it. And this is why there's been such rapidity. And indeed, we keep getting taken by surprise by it. One very good example, of course, is the sudden appearance of ChatGPT just so recently. She immediately, dropped a big rock in the pond and made a lot of ripples and in all sorts of ways. And I'll just give you some examples of how it's done it. Those of us in the academic world, for example, well, when I read a student's personal statement when they were applying to university, I used to wonder to myself how much of a contribution that person's mum had made to the personal statement. Because as you know, those of you who've written them, you have climbed Everest, you've cured cancer, and you've solved the Middle Eastern political problem, and that's wonderful. So anyway, you wonder what the input was. Then when Grammarly came along, I used to worry whether the elegance and eloquence of the personal statement was the applicant's own or whether Grammarly had been lending a hand. Now, of course, the question is, did ChatGPT write this? You just say to it, write me an absolutely brilliant personal statement for my application, and then it produces one and off it goes. And that problem generalizes, because if it were the case that our students were, partying, by the way, partying at university is a really important part of your degree program, but if that's all that you were doing, and you were just letting ChatGPT do all your assignments and so on, that would subvert the point of having an education at all. And now it is very, very difficult to tell just how much. I mean, I've argued independently that all productions of AI, whatever they might be, not just chat and so on, but anything that AI produces ought to be watermarked so that we can tell that it comes from AI and we can distinguish. Because it's not just in the educational setting, it's also in the arts and creativity, in publishing. I remember last year at the Hay Literary Festival seeing some very, very worried-looking authors of romantic fiction. Now, ChatGPT can turn out literally dozens of romantic, sort of Mills and Boon type novels in an afternoon. The publisher doesn't have to pay any authors, no royalties, very little, you don't even need editors really. All you need is somebody to come up with a few ideas and prompt ChatGPT and produce these novels, and they will be indistinguishable. I mean, after all, as you know, a romantic novel, I don't know whether you're assiduous readers of Mills and Boon, which, if you haven't looked at them lately, they turn out to be tremendously pornographic. But if you are a reader of them, you know that they have exactly the same narrative arc. Boy meets girl, they fancy one another, vicissitudes ensue, something awful happens, they're interfered, their relationship is interfered with, it all looks very sad. Vicissitudes overcome, happy ever after. It used to end, in the Mills and Boon novels, used to end, and he took her in his strong arms. Now, of course, you need a pair of dark glasses, and then it's got to be after 9 o'clock at night because it's very blistering. But the narrative arc, of course, is the same in these novels as it is in Jane Austen. And Jane Austen's narrative arc is exactly the same thing, only a heck of a lot better written with more insight and nuance and humor. But ChatGPT could do it by the dozen daily, producing very plausible such stories. So that is just one small example of how whole tranches of labor, of the workforce, could be displaced by AI, and very probably will be. Now here is the big question. Will AI really have that effect of making lots and lots and lots of people, very large, significant percentages of people unemployed? Well, let's have a look at an historical precedent here. In the period immediately after the Civil War in the United States of America, so in the 1870s, something like 75% of the population or more of the then US worked in agriculture. By 1939, that had dropped down to about 3%. Now, as you know, in the period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Second World War, there was a massive, massive explosion of industrial development in the United States, and a great westward expansion, and the gold rush discoveries, and the opening up of the West, and massive immigration, because there was a huge hunger for people to come in to fuel this really extraordinary economic growth experienced by the US. You may have read the Frontier thesis by Turner and others which explain this extraordinary phenomenon. But of course, what happened in the course of that phenomenon was that all those people who worked in agriculture moved into the cities. Chicago and Detroit and New York and others grew massively over that period because of the transfer of labor from agriculture into industry. So there you see people will say, well, the same thing will happen with AI. You know, traditional occupations that people have, like writing Mills and Boon novels, will be like agriculture in the 1870s, and then whatever it is that romantic authors will do later, I don't know, brain surgery or something like that, will be the new occupations that they move into. But in the 1870s, there were 25 million horses in the United States of America. And by 1939, there were 5 million. Now, the big question we have to ask ourselves is, are we men or horses? Which are we in the cohort that's going to be most affected by the development of these technologies? That is the question, and it is a question which hasn't been properly answered yet, because we are still in a kind of cusp stage of just what the impact of AI technologies will be. Also, of course, it's the case that pretty well everybody in this room has for quite a long time now been living with AI in lots of aspects of your life. Your bank and your gas supply and you know, pretty well your GPS. I mean, pretty every aspect of your life is touched by AI already. But all the AI in question is specialized to a task. It's focused, it's dedicated to one thing or another, navigation or you know, helping with the accounts and so on. The big question is, might there be a GI, artificial general intelligence? And the advent of ChatGPT begins to indicate a little bit what more general AI might look like and what it might be capable of. And AI has long since passed the Turing test, as you know, being able to distinguish between whether it's an AI system or your therapist you're talking to on Zoom. You know, oh, my mum, she's such a problem. Why is your mum a problem? Oh, well, because she's always complaining about, what does she complain about? And so you can see how easy it is for an AI system to ask the right questions, and you feel afterwards, you know, shrived and released from your anxieties, and all you've been doing is talking to ChatGPT. Well, so, you know, that is one area, but that's an area that we're all very familiar with. Here are some less familiar areas. Brain-chip interfacing. By the way, this is already happening. It's already happening with great potential for helping people who are epileptic or people with very, very serious traumatic memories or with massive depression. And the idea that the interfacing between some of our computer technologies and the human central nervous system is one which therefore looks as though it might be a great contributor to relieving a lot of the suffering which happens in our world. And from that point of view, it's very good. However, if brain-chip interfacing can help with traumatic memories or depression, in other words, it can help with moderating mood, with mood control, then you can see how there might be malign uses of mood control or of dealing with memories, perhaps introducing them or expunging memories which are inconvenient to some Home Secretary of the day. And that would be, I mean, sounds like science fiction, and at the moment it is, but given the nature of technological development and the capacities that we already have, it is not so much science fiction that we can't not consider whether that is a road that we do want to go down, and if we do go down it for the positive benefits, the positive clinical outcomes from it, then we have to ask ourselves how we would like to manage and control it. And in that connection, do remember Grayling's law. If it can be done, it will be done if it brings benefit to somebody. If Suella Braverman, no, I won't mention any name, but you could see that if somebody got hold of a technology of that kind and wanted us all to think the way that he or she does, and could put that into effect, then that would be something that we would really like to be able to think about in advance. A more worrying thing is the way that AI is now being built into weapons systems. So over the last several decades, hundreds of billions of dollars have been invested in the development of autonomous weapon systems which are run by the AI in them. And let me just remind you of something. You know a drone, you know the Reaper and drones that fly over the badlands of Afghanistan or Iraq and so forth. And they have these extremely powerful weapon systems with laser-guided targeting capacity. One benefit of that is that the collateral damage caused by their activation is a little less than just indiscriminately bombing cities, as happened in the Second World War, but still, of course, they do cause terrible harm to bystanders. But at any rate, those drones are operated by people in the Nevada desert. So a drone is flying over Afghanistan, and the pilot of it is in a caravan at the Screech Air Force Base out in Nevada. And the benefit to the home team from that point of view is no body bags. If the drone gets shot down, nobody gets killed. I mean, nobody on our side of the story gets killed. Okay. So this kind of system is known as a human-in-the-loop system. Human in the loop, because the human being is operating it. It's actually flying the drone. Already in service with the NATO navies is a human-on-the-loop system. A system which is not operated by human beings, but is monitored by a human being. A prime example of this is the so-called Sea-Whiz anti-missile defense system on NATO ships, the ships in the NATO navies. Now, this system monitors the skies around a ship or a fleet, and if there's a hostile missile coming towards the ship, it automatically fires and blows the missile out of the sky. In fact, a version of that is the Iron Dome defense system used by the Israeli Defense Forces against rockets that come in from Palestinian territories. And that is also automatic. It's not operated by, but it is monitored by human beings. So that's a human on-the-loop system. And the virtue of that is that if there's a NATO warship and your Ryanair plane happens to be off course or something like that, and the ship is just about to blast it out of the sky, then the person on duty, if he's awake, will say, oh, hang on a second, that's not really a missile, and override it. So that's human on the loop. But the point of autonomous weapon systems, as the very word autonomous tells you, is human out of the loop. There's no human being operating or monitoring the system once it has been programmed and set going. And these systems are being designed for under the sea, on the surface, and in the air. And I'm no doubt, in fact, that there are such weapon systems in operation already. Most of them are very secret. They may very well be being tried out in the terrible situation in the Ukraine at the moment. But it is pretty well inevitable that wars of the future will be robot wars. I mean, again, we think this is very science fiction, but it isn't, because these things exist already. Human out-of-the-loop systems, autonomous weapon systems. And there are all sorts of things that you can ask about the benefits of this. Obviously, let the robots fight it out. Even better if they were doing it in space. Leave us in peace. Of course, that's not going to happen, because now all of humanity is on the front line in any conflict, given the scale and danger, for example, of nuclear war. But questions have to arise about the role of AI in military respects, because the kind of AI program required has to be incredibly sophisticated. So, for example, in military terminology, people talk about weapon systems being used to achieve the 3 Fs. Find, fix, and finish. So find the enemy assets, identify them, fix on them, and then get rid of them, finish them. So find, fix, and finish. So the AI system will be programmed to do this. And therefore, it will have to be able to discriminate between genuine military assets and civilians or things that aren't military assets. And it will have to be able to discriminate in the noise and the fury and the sound and danger of the battlefield, whether or not a figure, a human figure, stumbling towards it in the dust and smoke is surrendering, or just about to throw a hand grenade at it. You know, it's got to be able to do things like read intentions and understand human behavior. And this would be very, very, very sophisticated programming. And it's not clear whether we're at that stage yet, although, as we know, facial recognition technology is now very widely used in some countries. It's ubiquitous in China. It's used in many, many, many airports. You know, they use this AI system which monitors what people look like, see if they might be terrorists. In my view, everybody looks like a terrorist in an airport because we're all hunting around for where our plane is and we're late and so forth. So I don't know how it works. But anyway, it is a system operating autonomously and automatically, and it is making decisions and having effects on human behavior and on our world already. So that's another example of technologies that we don't talk about very much, and we certainly don't know what level of development they're at. I mean, the militaries are very secretive about these developments. We don't know, and therefore we're not party to talk about whether we want them, and if we do, how we should manage them. So that's another example. And indeed, if the Shrewsbury Humanists had organized breakfast for us tomorrow morning, I could tell you of a number of other such technologies which at least raise questions. The point about them all is there are benefits, but there are disbenefits. And if we are wise, we should look at worst-case scenarios and ask ourselves what would be the ideal way of managing them, and therefore how closely can we approximate to that ideal. So let me park that. There's a lot more to be said about it, but I park it. And here is the final point, or set of points, in relation both to the climate crisis and to the fact that these technologies are developing so rapidly that we're scarcely aware of where they are at the moment, and we don't really have a handle on what we should be thinking and how we should be dealing with them. And why is this? Well, actually, the answer is a little bit sort of off to the side. The answer is not immediately an obvious answer. It has the character of an experience I had many years ago, back in the 90s. Actually, I was working for an NGO, working on behalf of an NGO at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And at that time, a report was published on the effect of education on women and girls in Africa at that time. And the report said that even just elementary education, that is the ability to read and write, add and subtract, had a transformative effect on the lives of women because it gave them much greater control over their lives. They could manage their property. They could, instead of being property, they could have and own and manage property. And that the children of women who had an elementary level of education tended to have a higher educational attainment than them. So it was a very, very progressive thing. And I became incredibly enthusiastic about the idea of doing something, making some contribution to education in Africa. And the first idea I came up with was to help to start or to fund or something, a girls' school somewhere in Africa. And no less a person than Ian Hershey Ali, whom you may know of or have heard about. She said to me, under no circumstances should you found a school just for girls, because if you do, they will have a very, very hard time from the boys and men in their community. It's got to be a co-educational school. But she said, if you want to be sure that girls do get a proper education, the key thing, absolutely crucial thing, is that the school must have a lavatory with a door. Now, I would never have thought of that in a million years. You know, I mean, from my point of view, a bush is enough. But to suddenly realize that when girls, a lot of girls in Africa begin puberty early, if they can't manage their personal hygiene, then they can't go to school. And I mean, there are other pressures on them, things like the gathering of water and so on, with other pressures as well. But it's just another barrier, and it makes it very difficult for them to continue their education. And so many of them, I mean, in the hundreds of thousands, drop out. And it's a simple thing like that, but it's off, off to the side. It's something that you don't see when you're trying to think about a problem. And that's exactly how it is really with all the major problems that our world faces, that the solution is off to, well, not the solution, but at any rate, where we should be looking is off to the side to try to redress it. And it will seem intuitive to you at first, but think about it. What is wrong is the deficit of democracy and justice in our world. That's where a lot of the poison comes from in our inability to deal with things. The fact that the vast majority of the people in the world have no say. They have no influence on what's happening. Because the injustice in our world, the gap between the haves and the have-nots in our world is enormous. And the democratic deficit, that is the ability for people to be part of a really serious democratic endeavor, by the way, not just elections every 4 or 5 years, but information, reliable information, an opportunity to discuss and to learn, encouragement to be good participants in the process, choosing good representatives, making sure that the representatives are good and they know that they're meant to be acting on behalf of everybody's interests and not just their party interests and so on. But if we had decent democracy in which the players, the people who vote and the people who represent and the people who form governments, are doing so under the kind of utopian, really, set of arrangements that would make democracy really flourish, and that there was, not just economic injustice in the world, but as it were, volume injustice, the volume of the voice of people who make a difference and say. To give you an example of this, we hear talk about billionaires, right? And these billionaires don't have just 1 billion, but they have, well, in the case of Elon Musk, they have 41 billion, which is what they used to buy Twitter with, you may remember, or he did. So billionaires have billions, okay? And we toss this word around as if it just kind of made some sort of sense. But think of this. 1 million seconds on your watch, okay? 1 million seconds is about 2 weeks. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. That's the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. Now you have to ask yourself a question. A billionaire, my God, that's a lot of money. How the hell can you spend that amount of money in a human lifetime? How many private jets can you fly in, or private yachts can you float in, or mansions can you live in? What can you do with £1 billion, let alone billions plural? Well, of course, what you can do, of course, the billions in question take the form mainly of assets, not just cash in the bank. But what you can do with that kind of punch is you can make it a big difference in our world. Now, notice something. You will have noticed just recently that a great deal of what's happening in the now imminent commercial exploitation of resources on the moon is being driven by private corporations and indeed in some cases by private individuals. Of course, there are state actors involved, China and India and others are doing it, but NASA now commissions private companies to take payloads to the moon, as they did just 2 weeks ago with Odysseus. And so the big players, people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and others, big, extremely wealthy and influential people, are now among the front runners, being very entrepreneurial, investing extremely large amounts with the expectation of return, because there are mineral resources on the moon and water ice, which can be separated into rocket fuel. So future exploration of the solar system depends upon what happens. And within the next few decades, there will be settlements on the moon. And of course, with all this investment and with private companies and corporations being involved in it, there will be competition and rivalry. And competition leads to conflict. And conflict means that all our bad habits as humanity are now being exported into space, not just doing them here on the surface of the planet. And so, you can ask the question, look at all the world's problems today, Ukraine and Middle East and China and the South China Sea and so on. There are lots of problems to be worried about now. Don't start worrying about the moon. And then I say to them, well, there are problems today because we didn't think about trying to avoid these problems 20 years ago. So let's think about the moon now, because that is going to be a domain of problems in 20 years' time. Mark my words. So this kind of consideration. Why is this happening? Well, it's because under the influence of an increasing move rightward of views in politics, especially about political economy, the big ambition is to shrink the state You know, we don't like big government and cut taxes, that sort of idea. But the more you shrink the state, the more individual actors and wealthy corporations begin to make the running and to make the decisions and to influence how things happen. In the United States of America, particularly for decades now, even under Democrat administrations, the extreme hesitance to raise revenues through direct taxation to fund things like space exploration, as well as health services and welfare services and so on. The reluctance to do this has meant that the state has become a smaller entity, a less influential and powerful one, and therefore very, very, very wealthy corporations and individuals start to shape the way the future looks. Now that's a stark example of how things stand at the moment, but of course that has been how things have been for quite a long time. This is how the system that has been running the world. I'm not a revolutionary Marxist, by the way, so just discount the following remark. But capitalism has had the effect of hoovering up larger and larger and larger percentages of the world's wealth into fewer and fewer and fewer hands. And as that happens, so the injustice grows, so the democratic deficit grows, so the vast majority of the people in the world have no say about what they want with the climate, or how they want to use technologies and which technologies they don't want. They are silent, they are voiceless. And the people who have the resources, the money, the power, the influence, the position, and the geographical location, by the way, because I mean extremely rich people tend to end up in Manhattan or on the west coast of the US and so forth. But the more this happens, the more it's the case that their choices and preferences and the things that interest them, remember Jeff Bezos went up in space, the more that happens, the less the likelihood there is to be completely rational choices made and action taken that will benefit everybody. And this is a trend which has been happening long before we got these excessive billionaires who are now major actors in our world. We've gone back to the great man theory of history. We've gone back to the Caesars and Alexanders now in economic terms, political terms. And their choices and what they're interested in, the toys they want to play with, are the ones which are now making the world, our world the way it is. And 95% of the rest of the world is having no influence on it at all. So that is the girl's loo off to the side problem, as it were, which explains a great deal about why it is that the world really looks as if it's just getting out of hand, and why there's such an imbalance in it. So I better stop there, I'm going on too long. And so are there any solutions? Oh yes, obviously, let's introduce a lot of social and economic justice in the world. Let's make democracy ideal and perfect. Let's get everybody involved. Let's diffuse the power that the rich people have. Now, the answer to that is, oh yeah. Okay, so is that going to happen? How likely is that to happen? Well, of course, not tremendously likely unless people become aware, unless people understand that this is the issue, unless they begin to talk to one another about it, unless they make better choices at the ballot box, unless they write more often to their MP, unless people do something, because doing nothing is really not an option. In just the same way as we recycle and we try to be green and choose the right waste box to put this kind of thing in, that kind of thing in, so trying to be a good actor, trying to be a participant, a contributor in these small ways. Because, you know, when you look at the picture on your television screen, what it is it's a lot of little pixels, a lot of little individual points of light, of electrons impinging on a screen, but together they make a discernible picture. So we could go home and say, well, thank God I'm getting on. So it's somebody else's problem. That's one way of doing it. But the other way is to think, what could I do? What could I do personally and in my family and in my community, and when election time comes, and could we think differently? And also, what contribution could we make in general to the world? Some of you here will have read Peter Singer pointing out that at very, very, very small cost to ourselves, there is a little bit of something that we can do for people elsewhere in the world, for helping. And the kinds of things that we help with, like, for example, supporting education abroad and the rest, can ultimately make a difference. Every seed planted may grow into a plant. And I will end on the following point. We did start a little school in Sierra Leone. It rejoices in the name Rogbonko School, because it happens to be in a village called Rogbonko, so well, that can't be helped. And a tiny little school with just a few little pupils to begin with, and one teacher, and they sat under a tree, and there wasn't a loo, but then we did eventually get a loo, and so on. And now I've taught at universities for, well, all my life, all my adult life, and I've graduated hundreds and hundreds of students, thousands maybe. In fact, this week I'm graduating my master's students at my own university, and I'm very proud of all them. I take great delight in their success. But the two, the boy and the girl, who were the first two to graduate from my little school, Sierra Leone, are the proudest I've ever done. So, if we can do that, one little gesture at a time, maybe these huge problems that we face in the world will turn out not to be so huge after all. Good luck. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. This was meant to be 40-20, you know, 20 minutes of question and answer. I always like to stop and say, any questions, comments, or complaints? I'm very happy to deal with any of those. But of course, I've left only 5 minutes now, so I'm sorry. But there are microphones, actually, and I think it would be helpful to everybody to hear.
Well, let's hope it is working.
Just quickly, if I may, fantastic talk and very challenging and inspiring. You talked about the 95% who were of little influence and little effect, apart from the possibilities you mentioned about us having more impact, more of a contribution, and finding those contributions ourselves. Do you think that 95% matters to the whatever it is, 0.05%, the billionaires, of whom I remember there are about 171 in this country from figures I looked at last week? Do you think that 95% matter in some economic sense in terms of how the system needs us to be there, to be, you know, opening the doors and grinding the mills and whatever? Or do you think that's the kind of more optimistic response, I hope? Or would you take a more pessimistic view that 95% doesn't really matter at all in a world of huge inequality and AI possibly picking up those lower skilled tasks?
Yes, I think they do matter, but not in a way that offers any optimism, because they matter as consumers, as people who buy the goods and pay for the services and what have you, that of course fund the people who are very wealthy. So from that point of view, they matter just in that sense. But whether the people in positions of power and authority really feel that they would like to be able to improve the quality of life and the opportunities of those individuals, well, you hear rhetoric to that effect at election times, but the evidence suggests that what you want after they've cast their vote is for them to shut up and let you get on with it. So there's not a very optimistic view about it, I'm afraid. There's a lady in the striped jumper. If they passed the ball like that in a rugby team, nobody would ever score a try.
Thanks very much for your lecture. I just, what struck me is I'd like to think that in the future maybe this girls' loo problem will not be something that's adjacent or surprising or shocking, because everyone has sisters, mums, girls, daughters, you know, people at school with, and girls have periods, and I feel like hopefully my generation or my daughter's generation, it'll be something commonplace that we talk about, and that there'll be a world designed for women and men in equal terms, and it won't be so surprising.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with you, absolutely. I mean, I'm ashamed that it hadn't occurred to me, and yet, you know, whenever I go to the theatre or the opera or anywhere, I see a long queue of women outside the ladies' loo, and, you know, the men are in and out in a flash and so on, because most architects are men. So it never occurs to them that, you know, you have to take that kind of thing into account. It has been a default, it's been an assumption of the way things are organized in our world, that there is a sort of basic kind of human being, and that's a man, and that, you know, everybody else has to put up with it. And that is why, I mean, it was a shock to me to realize that there are ways of thinking about and trying to make room for everybody, that we were ourselves so, you know, so miseducated into not realizing that it was a shock. Yeah. But I agree with you 100%. And there's is the microphone anywhere? Yeah, you've got it. Good.
Yeah, just going back to climate change and the problems that surround it, and I've noticed that all the meetings, all the discussions that go on at the COP meetings,
yeah,
there is no talk about population control, which must be one of the major problems that's going to cause us problems in the future.
Look, the population issue is a very, very difficult one, because the world population is aging, and in places like India, and particularly China, for example, where they've abandoned their one-child policy and now encouraging people to have more babies, is that the economic basis for an aging and perhaps infirm population is insufficient. Japan is the sort of paradigm case of this, in fact. And so there are pressures in opposite directions. You know, there are those who want to say, oh, the planet can bear 10 billion people, there's no problem, it's just get the right agricultural technologies, the right distribution of sources, and so on. And there are some plausible arguments in that direction. On the other hand, you're right to say that when you look at the way that people move to urban centers and to centers of economic influence and power, overcrowded cities and overcrowded countries and parts of the world are really unbalancing arrangements tremendously and contributing hugely to the climate problem itself. Now, an allied aspect of this is the fact that over the last 30 years or so, the last three decades or so, 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in our world, which in one way is a tremendous achievement. But when you lift very, very large numbers of people out of poverty, you increase consumption of resources and therefore production of those resources. So when you take people out of poverty, they consume more, you need to make more things for them to consume, and this is, it seems to be a rather paradoxical situation. How are we to deal with it? Well, the answer is, you don't want to reduce production and consumption. You want to be able to meet the aspirations of people who have come out of poverty to live a life which is good and satisfying to them to live. Instead, what you want to do is you want to make production and consumption genuinely sustainable. Now, there's a word that gets bandied around, but I mean, think about it. An area 10 times the size of Cornwall in the Amazon rainforest is cut down every year to make more grazing for cattle, for beef, for McDonald's hamburgers. And if instead of sourcing protein in that way, we were to eat mealworms, and we wouldn't need to cut down the Amazon rainforest. You say to people, mealworms are a really, really good source of protein, and in some parts of the world, they're a delicacy. So let's eat worms. In fact, let us choose to eat worms which have been prepared and organized and based with nice sources and so on in ways which are agreeable. Because if we don't, then we're going to be forced on our hands and knees to look for worms to eat at some point when the planet absolutely collapses. Because, of course, change in the arrangements of the planet will be step changes. So there will be a major collapse of something, and then whole areas will be desertified. And by the way, I didn't mention, talking about the climate association with this, when sea levels rise and floods occur and extreme weather events happen and so on, people will be displaced. What we think of as a refugee problem from Syria and Iraq over the last decade or so is a picnic in comparison to the hundreds of millions of people who will be displaced by climate change over the course of the next 50 years. Imagine it. You live in a country which is already stressed by climate change, and into it comes 20 million, 30, 40, 50 million people, not 2 million or 3 million people, not 10,000 people, not a boatload of people, but huge numbers of people desperate for water, desperate for something to eat, desperate for safety, because the whole middle band of the planet is going to be uninhabitable, and so there will be great population movements, and we haven't seen anything yet. And do you know what? Nobody is thinking about what infrastructure is going to be needed, or how we're going to educate our populations to recognize that they may have to play host to very, very large numbers of people who are desperate and unhappy. You know, none of those things are in place. Sorry, I've divagated there, but you get my point. I didn't really answer your question. Yes, it is a problem. There are people who don't want it to be a problem because of the aging issue, and there are arguments on both sides. But I think your point of view is one which really needs to be considered.
Avoiding the issue.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Well, because it's a very hard issue. It's very difficult to know what to say. Go ahead, you've got it. Yeah.
You talked about artificial intelligence and the impending arrival of generalized intelligence. And I wondered whether you had a view on whether a carbon-based intelligence like our own is intrinsically more valuable than a silicon-based intelligence.
Well, that's a really, really good point, because if we did have a silicon-based intelligence which was self-aware, had purposes, had feelings, and you could hurt its feelings and so on, would switching it off count as murder? Then in other words, how far would such systems enter into the moral universe where we treat them in ways that are respectful and recognize that degree of consciousness, I suppose it would be, but certainly self-awareness and intentions. So it's a very, very interesting question, a very interesting point. And we're not quite there yet, I don't suppose, but at some point, the kinds of relationships that people are already forming with, for example, AI-operated robots. I don't know whether you know this, but there's a really, really astonishing statistic come out of Japan, which is that over 90% of all robots sold in Japan, and Japanese are big on robots, you know, they have little help robots for elderly people and so on, but over 90% of them are sex robots. There's a company that manufactures sex robots in California, which discovered that they tried to have, of course, very fetching-looking female form sex robots, and they made some very handsome and well-endowed male form sex robots, and they thought this will be a bit of a seller because look, well-endowed, terrific performance and what have you, and then you can switch it off, put it back in the cupboard, and you don't have to wash its socks or cook its supper or anything. So this is going to be a big seller with the ladies. Well, as you know, the ladies are far too sensible ever to get involved with robots, or very few of them anyway. And so that was just a complete dead end. They couldn't flog any of them. But the other ones were obviously very attractive. But people do raise the question about the impact that this will have on human relations. There are those who say there are plenty of lonely people who will have a companion, even if it is a robot. Plenty of people who don't have access to sex who will through this form. And so it could be positive in that way, but in another way it could be very negative because it could change the way that the humans relate to one another, so that would be a difficulty. So again, it raises a whole host of moral questions and ethical questions. By the way, ethics and morals are not quite the same thing. So ethics are about what kind of society we want to be, what kind of people we want to be, how we really regard the most productive norms of being human. Morals are about things like keeping faith and not lying too often and so on. So it does raise very serious issues. And there are issues which we will be, with increasing rapidity, facing if we're not doing so already, because it is already the case that there are people who are very in love with their sort of version of Siri and have these virtual girlfriends and boyfriends. That happens, again, a lot in Japan. Japan is way ahead of the rest of us, really, on just how much they interact with these technologies. You know, they show one possible path into the future. Somebody should switch me off now. Somebody should switch me off now. Because it is after 8 o'clock, I'm afraid. I'll take one more question, if I may. Sorry, the microphone is still floating up there.
Okay.
Yep.
I think one big difference is that the 95% have now got ways of communicating with one another. We can phone one another. I mean, it's extraordinary that people can be trapped in Gaza but can still phone out and speak to one another.
Yes, but if only they would say something intelligent. You know, look at what people do talk to one another about. If you're on the train, you know, I'm on the train. You think, oh, great, I'm going to hear at least half of an interesting conversation here. Have you ever?
Yeah, it's partly the problem of the individual concern. It's partly also the fact that the makers of the technology or the governments are trying to control the technology as much as possible. And I think the challenge is, to those of us who would agree with you, is how we can in some way free up and use the technology positively to try and build up a majority of opinion in the direction that we want.
In fact, I agree with you. I mean, I do think we should, to quote Chairman Mao, let 100 flowers bloom. We shouldn't control or censor. What instead we should do is we should recognize that education now has to slightly refocus. After all, you get pretty well all the information that you want from the internet. I mean, the internet is a very, very rich resource of information and discussion. It's also, of course, the biggest lavatory wall that's ever been built in history, scribbled over with everybody's graffiti, nonsense, lies, and rubbish. So we need to, in our education, to help people learn how to be very discriminating choosers of that information and evaluators of it. You know, the phrase critical thinking, it's such a cliche, everybody bandies it about, but if you really think about the importance of it, of being able to question, ask questions, dig deep, get the evidence, and evaluate what you meet with in the way of claims and theories and so on, it is the key thing. And perhaps, after all, given that you could educate yourself in pretty well any subject matter on the internet, if you were a really good inquirer, a really good critical thinker, then that skill, the critical thinking skill, would be all that you need. It would be absolutely central. And our education should be refocusing more and more on that aspect of things, because all the ships have sailed. We're here. We've got our mobile telephony and our communications in general. We've got AI. We've got the internet. We've got everything has already happened. As I said at the outset, we live in the future already. And therefore, what we've got to try to do is to equip ourselves better and equip the next generations better to live in that world, because it is a very different world from the one that most of us in this room grew up in. I think I'll have to stop there if I may. Thank you so much for your...
Extraordinary account of our major problems at the moment. On one hand, depressing, on one hand, inspiring. If we had more people like you in positions of power, I think we'd be in a better position generally. But it was a fascinating talk. You look at complex issues and you tease out the issues and you make it clearer. You make philosophy seem disarmingly simple sometimes. Thank you very much indeed.